On the morning of February 23, 1945, Joe Rosenthal climbed Mount Suribachi on the island of Iwo Jima, carrying 4 pounds of aluminum, mahogany, and glass. He reached the summit. He raised the camera. He pressed the shutter once. The negative was a single sheet of 4x5 film, loaded by hand in darkness, exposed in less than 1/500th of a second. It would become the most reproduced photograph in American history. It would be cast in bronze as the largest bronze statue ever poured on American soil. It would appear on 3.5 billion postage stamps. The camera that made it was built in Rochester, New York. It was called the Speed Graphic. It was made by a company called Graflex. 14 years later, in 1959, a Japanese camera called the Nikon F entered the American market. Within a decade, Associated Press, the wire service that had equipped every one of its photographers with a Speed Graphic, had retired the camera entirely. The machine that captured the defining image of American victory could not survive the peace that followed. But the story of Graflex is not the story of a camera that failed. It is the story of a camera that succeeded completely, that became so essential to American photojournalism, so embedded in the infrastructure of how this country recorded itself, that when it was finally replaced, an entire visual grammar of American life disappeared with it. Every week on this channel, we tell the stories of the American companies that built the tools that recorded American life and what the market did to them. Like the video and subscribe if that history matters to you. This story begins not on a Pacific island, but in Rochester, New York in 1887. Rochester, New York in 1887 was already becoming the most important city in American photography. Eastman Kodak was 2 years from introducing roll film to the consumer market. Bausch & Lomb was grinding optical glass on the west side of the city. The infrastructure of American image-making was being assembled block by block along the Genesee River. It was in that city in that year that 2 men named William F. Fulmer and William E. Schwing opened a manufacturing operation on the edge of the Rochester commercial district. They made bicycle lamps. They made flash equipment for photographers. They made cameras, large, precise, built for professionals who needed a negative large enough to print without significant enlargement. Their company was called Fulmer and Schwing Manufacturing Company. It was not yet Graflex. But the engineering instinct that would define Graflex for the next 80 years was already present. Build it heavy, build it accurate, build it for the man who cannot afford to miss the shot. In 1905, Eastman Kodak acquired Fulmer and Schwing outright. The purchase made strategic sense. Kodak was in the business of selling film, and Fulmer and Schwing made cameras that consumed large quantities of it. The combined operation was renamed the Fulmer Graflex Corporation and absorbed into Kodak's Rochester manufacturing complex. For 20 years, the cameras that would define American photojournalism were built inside the walls of the company that also made the film that ran through them. That arrangement ended in 1926. Under pressure from a Federal Trade Commission consent decree limiting Kodak's vertical integration in the photographic equipment market, Kodak spun off the camera-making operation as an independent company. Graflex Incorporated established its own manufacturing facility at 900 St. Paul Street in Rochester, fewer than 2 miles from Kodak Park, fewer than 3 miles from the Bausch & Lomb optical plant that supplied lenses to half the camera industry in America. The separation was clean on paper. In practice, Graflex remained embedded in the Rochester photographic economy for the rest of its existence, buying film from Kodak, sourcing optical components from Bausch & Lomb, drawing its engineering workforce from the same pool of precision manufacturing talent that Kodak had spent 40 years cultivating in the Genesee Valley. Before Graflex, before the Speed Graphic, American press photographers worked with equipment that was fundamentally unsuited to the job they were asked to do. View cameras required a tripod, glass plate negatives were fragile and slow to handle, flash equipment was external, unreliable, and dangerous. A press photographer covering a courthouse proceeding or a political rally could not reload quickly, could not move freely, and could not control light in an interior space with any consistency. The Speed Graphic, introduced in its mature form in 1912, solved all of it at once. It was a camera a man could carry in one hand. It had a focal plane shutter, a mechanism built into the body itself, independent of the lens, that could fire at speeds up to 1/1000th of a second. It had a synchronized flash connection that allowed a photographer to fire a flashbulb at the precise moment the shutter opened, without a separate cable, without a separate trigger. It accepted 4 by 5-inch sheet film, a negative surface area 14 times larger than a 35mm frame that could be contact printed directly onto photographic paper and delivered to a newspaper engraving department without the resolution loss that enlargement introduced. At approximately $175 with a standard lens in 1940, the equivalent of roughly $3,800 today, the speed graphic was not an inexpensive instrument. But for an American newspaper that needed publishable photographs on deadline, in any light, in any location, it was the only instrument that reliably delivered them. The U.S. Army Signal Corps understood this before most American newspapers did. By the time the United States entered World War I in 1917, Signal Corps photographers were already operating Graflex cameras in field conditions that would have destroyed lesser equipment. The contract that followed the first of many government procurement relationships that would sustain Graflex through the middle decades of the 20th century established something that no amount of retail advertising could purchase: institutional trust. By the early 1920s, Associated Press had placed the speed graphic on its recommended equipment list for wire service photographers. The camera had not been on the market for a decade. It was already the standard. To understand what the speed graphic meant to an American press photographer in 1945, you have to hold one in your hands. The body was aluminum and mahogany, a folding design that collapsed flat for carrying and extended forward on a set of precision-machined rails when opened for use. The lens standard, the front plate that held the lens, could be tilted and shifted to correct perspective distortion, a capability borrowed from architectural view cameras and almost never found in a handheld press instrument. The entire assembly, without a lens and without a film holder, weighed 4 pounds. Loaded and ready lens-mounted film holder, inserted flashbulb in the reflector rangefinder set, a working speed graphic weighed closer to 7. It was not a light camera. It was never designed to be. What it was designed to be was a system. The focal plane shutter, a curtain of rubberized fabric that traveled across the film plane at speeds ranging from 1/10 to 1,000th of a second, positioned in the camera body rather than inside the lens, meant that a photographer could change lenses without losing shutter capability. A wide-angle lens for courtroom interiors, a longer lens for a speaker on a distant platform. The same shutter, the same body, the same film holders for both. In an era when most press cameras locked the photographer into a single focal length, the speed graphic offered a system. The rangefinder, a separate optical device mounted on the side of the camera body that allowed the photographer to align 2 superimposed images in a small window to confirm focus without looking through the taking lens itself, was calibrated to specific lenses and distances. It was not as precise as ground glass focusing under a dark cloth, but it was fast. In a courtroom, in a hotel ballroom, at the edge of an airfield, fast mattered more than perfect. The film holder was the ceremony of the speed graphic. Each holder was a flat, light-tight cassette approximately 5 inches wide and 6 inches long that carried 2 sheets of 4 by 5 film, one on each side. Before a shoot, a photographer loaded holders in a darkroom, opening the back of the holder under safe light, sliding a sheet of film into the groove, closing the holder, flipping it, loading the second sheet. In the field, the sequence was fixed and invariable. Insert the holder into the camera back. Pull the dark slide, a thin metal sheet that protected the film from light, straight up and out. Fire the shutter. Reinsert the dark slide, reverse to signal that side had been exposed. Remove the holder. Reverse it. Insert the dark side facing forward. Repeat. 1 photograph per operation. No exceptions. No second chances without a loaded holder in hand. At $175 with a standard Graflex Optar 135mm f 4.7 lens in 1940, approximately $3,800 in today's dollars. The speed graphic was priced above the cheapest German imports, but below the Leica 3C rangefinder, which sold for approximately $225 in the same year. The Leica offered 35mm film and 36 exposures per roll. The speed graphic offered 1 exposure per holder and a negative 14 times larger. For an American newspaper whose photo engraving department was calibrated to 4 by 5 negatives, that difference in negative size was not a technical preference. It was a production requirement. The wire services sent photographs by wire photo transmission, an early facsimile system that required a high-resolution original to survive the signal degradation of transcontinental transmission. A 4x5 negative survived that process. A 35mm negative enlarged to the same output size often did not. The speed graphic did not win American photojournalism by being the most sophisticated camera available. It won by being the most practical camera for the specific industrial requirements of American newspaper production in the 1930s and 1940s, the print deadline, the wire photo drum, the engraving department, the composing room. Every step of the American newspaper production chain in that era was optimized around a 4x5 negative. Graflex built the camera that produced it. The institutional endorsement list that accumulated through the 1930s and 1940s was not the result of advertising. It was the result of performance under conditions that no other camera manufacturer had engineered for. Associated Press, United Press International, International News Photos, the U.S. Army Signal Corps, the U.S. Navy Photographic Unit, Life Magazine, Look Magazine, the White House Press Corps under Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, and Dwight Eisenhower. The name on the camera strap was not a city of origin. It was a standard. By 1940, there was no serious competitor to the speed graphic in American professional photography. Not because Graflex had eliminated its competition, because the speed graphic had become something that transcended competition. It had become infrastructure. Consider what that word meant in practice. Every metropolitan daily newspaper in the United States with a photo department, the New York Daily News, the Chicago Tribune, the Los Angeles Times, the Atlanta Constitution, the Detroit Free Press standardized on the speed graphic, not because a salesman had persuaded an equipment manager, but because every photographer they hired already knew how to operate one. The camera had become the common language of American press photography. A photographer who moved from the Milwaukee Journal to the Washington Post brought his speed graphic with him, and his film holders fit the camera on loan at the new bureau, and his technique required no adjustment. The system was interchangeable because the system was universal. The U.S. Army Signal Corps took that universality and made it military doctrine. Beginning in 1941, every photographer assigned to an accredited combat unit in the United States Army was issued a speed graphic as standard equipment, not recommended, issued. The Signal Corps trained its photographers on the speed graphic at the Army Pictorial Center in Long Island City, New York, a facility that processed millions of feet of film and hundreds of thousands of still photographs over the course of the war. The photographs that documented American military operations in North Africa, in Italy, and France, and the Pacific. The images that appeared in Stars and Stripes in Life in every American newspaper that ran wire service photographs were made predominantly on speed graphics loaded with Kodak sheet film processed in field darkrooms and transmitted by portable wire photo equipment to bureaus in London, Paris, and New York. The U.S. Navy operated its own photographic units under parallel doctrine. Naval aviators who required gun camera footage for after-action analysis used different equipment. Naval photographers documenting fleet operations, amphibious landings, and carrier deck operations used speed graphics. The FBI photographic unit standardized on speed graphics for crime scene documentation and evidence photography throughout the 1940s and 1950s. The precision of a 4x5 negative, its ability to render a fingerprinted document, a ballistic wound with unambiguous clarity made it the forensic standard before the term forensic photography had entered common professional usage. Hollywood's major studios maintained still photography departments whose sole function was producing publicity images for distribution to newspapers and fan magazines. MGM, Paramount, Warner Brothers, RKO, each employed staff photographers whose working tool was the speed graphic. The photographs of Humphrey Bogart, Katharine Hepburn, Cary Grant, and Marilyn Monroe that appeared in American newspapers and fan magazines through the 1940s and 1950s were made in studio still departments on 4x5 sheet film in the flat, flashlit, brilliantly sharp aesthetic that the speed graphics design naturally produced. The White House Press Corps had used Graflex cameras since the Coolidge administration. By the time Franklin Roosevelt was conducting his fireside chat broadcasts and his wartime press conferences, the cameras raised by the press corps in the East Room of the White House were speed graphics. The images of Roosevelt, Truman, and Eisenhower that the American public associated with presidential authority, sharp formal lit by synchronized flash printed large and clean, were made on those cameras. At its manufacturing peak in the 1940s, the Graflex plant at 900 St. Paul Street in Rochester employed approximately 700 workers producing speed graphics. Crown Graphics and the associated accessories film holders, flash synchronizers, rangefinder units carrying cases that the professional market required. Total speed graphic production across all variants from the original 1912 model through the final pacemaker series of the 1950s is estimated at more than 250,000 units. For a camera that sold primarily to professionals and institutions, at prices equivalent to several months of a working photographer's salary, that number was not modest. It reflected a market in which the speed graphic had no meaningful domestic competitor and only marginal foreign competition. The German camera industry, like a Zeiss Voigtländer, offered precision 35mm instruments of extraordinary optical quality. But the American newspaper production chain did not want 35mm. It wanted 4x5, and 4x5 in America meant Graflex. Then came the photographs, not the catalog of institutional adopters, not the production statistics. The photographs themselves, the specific images that exist in the American visual memory, because a photographer raised a speed graphic at a specific moment in a specific place and pressed a shutter that had been manufactured on St. Paul Street in Rochester, New York. On May 6, 1937, the German airship Hindenburg approached its mooring mast at Lakehurst Naval Air Station in New Jersey and caught fire. Sam Scher of the International News Photo Service was standing on the field with a speed graphic. He had no time to raise the camera to eye level. He raised it to his waist, aimed by instinct, and fired. The image the airship's tail section consumed in a column of fire, while the mooring line still hung slack, ran on the front page of newspapers across the country the following morning. It became the defining visual record of the disaster. Scher made one exposure, one sheet of film. There was no second chance. On February 23, 1945, Joe Rosenthal of the Associated Press climbed Mount Suribachi on Iwo Jima and photographed 5 Marines and 1 Navy corpsman raising an American flag on a length of pipe. The negative was a single sheet of 4x5 film. Rosenthal was not certain he had captured the moment. He shot a second frame, a posed group photograph of the men gathered around the flag, and submitted both to the AP darkroom in Guam without knowing which had succeeded. The first frame succeeded. It won the Pulitzer Prize. It was reproduced on 3.5 billion postage stamps. It was cast in bronze at a scale of 32 feet at the Marine Corps War Memorial in Arlington, Virginia. It was made on a speed graphic. On August 14, 1945, Alfred Eisenstadt of Life magazine was in Times Square when the announcement of Japan's surrender reached the streets. A sailor grabbed a nurse he had never met and kissed her. Eisenstadt raised his speed graphic and fired 4 frames in rapid succession. One of those frames became the most widely recognized photograph of the end of World War II. It was made on a speed graphic. These were not accidents of equipment. They were the result of a camera designed specifically for the conditions under which those photographs were made. Outdoor light. No tripod, one chance, no motor drive, no burst mode, no review screen. A sheet of film, a shutter, a man who knew his machine well enough that the mechanical sequence from camera raised to shutter fired required no conscious thought. There is a sensory memory attached to the speed graphic that the audience for this story will recognize even if they never held one. It is the memory of the photographs themselves, the flat, shadowless, flashlit black and white prints that defined what American news photography looked like for 30 years. The faces pressed forward by direct flash. The backgrounds falling into gray, the edges of the frame sharp and unforgiving. That aesthetic was not a stylistic choice. It was the physics of a synchronized flashbulb firing at 1/100th of a second through a 135mm lens at 10 feet. The speed graphic did not produce that look because photographers preferred it. It produced that look because that was what the camera and the light and the film and the deadline demanded. Every American who opened a newspaper between 1930 and 1960 looked at speed graphic photographs without knowing the camera's name. They knew the photographs. They trusted them. The camera that made them was invisible, which is the highest compliment any instrument can receive. But invisibility has a cost. When the instrument is replaced, only the photographs remain. The machine that made them is already gone, and by 1959, the machine that would replace it had arrived. In the fall of 1959, a Japanese camera appeared in the display cases of professional camera dealers on 47th Street in Manhattan. It was called the Nikon F. It weighed 1.8 pounds without a lens. It accepted 35mm roll film, 36 exposures per roll. It had an interchangeable lens mount that accepted lenses from 21mm to 1000mm. It had a removable viewfinder that could be replaced with a waist-level finder, a metered prism, or a high-magnification focusing unit. It had a motor drive accessory that could advance film and fire the shutter at 3 frames per second. It was priced at $329.50 with a 50mm f2 Nikon lens. The Speed graphic pacemaker in the same year sold for approximately $200 with a standard lens. It weighed 4 pounds without film holders. It offered 1 exposure per manual reload. It had no motor drive. It had no interchangeable viewfinder system. Its lens selection, while adequate, was not a system in the sense that the Nikon F's growing catalog of Nikon lenses constituted a system. The numbers told the story that no press release from Rochester could answer. But the numbers alone did not decide the outcome. What decided it was a single operational reality that wire service photographers understood immediately, and that Graflex had no engineering response to 36 frames versus 1. A photographer covering a political rally with a speed graphic carried a bag of pre-loaded film holders, each holder containing 2 sheets of film, each sheet requiring a complete manual sequence to expose. In the same bag at the same weight, a photographer carrying a Nikon F with 3 loaded camera bodies carried 108 exposures. The arithmetic was not subtle. In the compressed, unpredictable, unrepeatable moments that defined wire service photography, a candidate's expression at the precise second a question landed a crowd's reaction in the instant before it resolved into calm or chaos. The photographer with 108 exposures had a structural advantage over the photographer with 16 that no amount of individual skill could consistently overcome. Graflex understood the threat. The company's response was the Crown graphic introduced in 1947 and the Century graphic introduced in 1949, lighter, more compact variants of the Speed graphic that reduced weight and improved portability without abandoning the 4x5 format. Both were competent instruments. Neither addressed the fundamental limitation that the wire services had already identified. A lighter Speed graphic was still a Speed graphic. It still loaded 1 sheet at a time. In 1955, Graflex introduced the Graphic 70, a medium-format camera using 70mm roll film designed to offer the film capacity of a roll film camera with a negative larger than 35mm. It found a limited market among photographers who needed more than 35mm resolution but could not accept the operational constraints of sheet film. It did not save the company's position in the wire service market because the wire service market was already beginning to evaluate the Nikon on its merits. The pivot that might have mattered a complete 35mm DSLR system designed around the professional photojournalist's actual workflow with a robust lens system and a motor drive from the outset never came from Rochester. Whether Graflex lacked the engineering capital, the manufacturing capacity, or the institutional willingness to abandon the format that had made its reputation is a question the historical record does not answer cleanly. What the record shows is that the pivot did not happen in time. By 1961, AP photographers in New York and Washington were carrying Nikon F bodies alongside their Speed graphics, not instead of, alongside. The Speed graphic remained the camera of record for situations where a large negative was specifically required, certain courtroom assignments, certain studio portrait sessions, certain architectural documentation work. But for breaking news, for political coverage, for the fast-moving, unpredictable assignments that defined daily wire service work, the Nikon F had become the primary instrument. By 1963, it was no longer alongside. It was instead of. The transition did not happen by corporate decree. It happened photographer by photographer, bureau by bureau, as the men who had carried Speed graphics for 20 years picked up a Nikon F for a single assignment and did not put it down again. The camera was lighter. It was faster. It allowed mistakes the 35th frame that caught what the first 34 had missed. The speed graphic did not allow mistakes. It demanded certainty before the shutter fired. That demand had once been the source of the speed graphics authority. By 1963, it had become its epitaph. In 1945, Graflex Incorporated was sold to General Precision Equipment Corporation, a New York-based industrial conglomerate with holdings in defense electronics navigation instruments and precision manufacturing. The sale was not a distress transaction. Graflex was profitable. The speed graphic was at the peak of its institutional dominance. General Precision paid a reasonable price for a company that appeared to have a durable market position and a loyal professional customer base. What General Precision could not have known in 1945, what no one in Rochester could have known in 1945, was that the professional customer base was 14 years from abandoning the product entirely. General Precision held Graflex through the 1950s and into the 1960s, through the Crown Graphic and the Century Graphic and the Graphic 70 and the Graflex XL, a medium-format rangefinder camera introduced in 1965 that used 120 roll film and represented the company's most serious attempt to compete in the post-speed graphic professional market. The XL was a capable instrument. It was too late and too limited in its lens system to recover ground that had already been ceded to Nikon, to Canon, to the Japanese camera industry that had spent a decade building the interchangeable lens ecosystems that professional photographers had migrated into. In 1968, General Precision sold Graflex to Singer Corporation, the sewing machine manufacturer that had diversified into business machines and precision instruments in an attempt to stabilize revenues against a declining domestic sewing market. Singer had no particular expertise in photographic equipment. It had no strategic vision for the Graflex brand. It had a manufacturing facility in Rochester that it did not know what to do with, and a product line whose primary market had already chosen a different camera. Production of the speed graphic ceased. The Graflex XL was discontinued. The Rochester plant went quiet. Orders stopped arriving. The tooling sat idle. The camera repair technicians who had spent careers learning the focal plane shutter mechanism of the speed graphic, the tension adjustment, the curtain replacement, the synchronization calibration that kept a press camera accurate to 1/500th of a second after years of field use, had no new cameras to service. Their knowledge was precise, certified, and suddenly without application. They did not retire. The work retired around them. The flashbulb manufacturers who had supplied the press photography market, General Electric's Photo Flash division, Sylvania's flashbulb line, discontinued their press camera products through the late 1960s and early 1970s as the market contracted below the threshold of profitable production. The photo engraving departments at American newspapers, which had been calibrated around 4x5 negatives for 40 years, retooled for 35 millimeters. The darkroom technicians who had loaded speed graphic film holders by feel in orange Safelight found that the new workflow did not require their specific skill. The 4x5 sheet film market did not disappear. It contracted into a specialty segment: architectural photographers, fine art photographers, studio portraitists who valued large negative resolution over operational speed. Kodak and Ilford continued manufacturing 4x5 sheet film. They still do. But the institutional market, the wire services, the newspapers, the military photographic units was gone. And without the institutional market, the economic logic that had sustained Graflex for 60 years no longer existed. Singer sold the Graflex name and remaining assets in the early 1970s. The brand passed through subsequent hands without manufacturing activity of consequence. The address at 900 St. Paul Street in Rochester was eventually occupied by other businesses. The workers dispersed into the broader Rochester economy, some to Kodak, some to Bausch and Lomb, some to industries that had nothing to do with photography. The speed graphic had not failed. It had been surpassed. The distinction matters. A camera that fails leaves a gap. A camera that is surpassed leaves a standard, a record of what was possible at a specific moment in American photographic history, against which everything that came after must be measured. The Nikon F that replaced it was a better camera for the work that needed to be done in 1963. That is not an argument against Graflex. It is the argument that the market made photographer by photographer, bureau by bureau, until there was no argument left to make. The speed graphics did not disappear when Graflex did. They went into closets, into camera bags that stopped being carried to assignments and started being stored on shelves, into estate sales in Rochester and Chicago and Washington, where the children of wire service photographers who had carried these cameras for 20 years opened the cases, looked at the equipment inside, and did not know what they were looking at. From those estate sales, the cameras moved into the secondary market. They moved onto eBay, where a working speed graphic pacemaker in good condition with a Graflex Optar lens sells today for between $150 and $300 and typically finds a buyer within 48 hours. They moved into antique stores in upstate New York, where they sit in display cases next to Kodak Brownies and Argus C3S priced at $200 and occasionally negotiated down to $175, still functional, still capable of producing a negative of extraordinary quality if someone loads a film holder and points the camera at something worth photographing. Some of them are being loaded. The large format photography community in the United States, photographers who shoot 4x5 and 8x10 sheet film, by deliberate choice for the resolution and tonal quality that no digital sensor at any price has fully replicated, has adopted the speed graphic as a field camera of genuine utility, not as a museum piece, as a working instrument. The Large Format Photography Forum at largeformatphotography.info maintains active threads on speed graphic lens compatibility, shutter repair, film holder sourcing, and shooting technique. The camera that AP retired in 1963 is being used in 2024 by photographers who were born after the last wire service speed graphic was put in a storage closet. The George Eastman Museum in Rochester, New York, the world's oldest photography museum, located fewer than 3 miles from the former Graflex plant on St. Paul Street, holds speed graphic specimens across multiple production variants, along with archival material documenting Graflex's manufacturing history and its place in the Rochester photographic economy. The museum's collection includes cameras that were used by working press photographers, instruments that made actual photographs of actual events, alongside the production records that document how they were built. The Film Photography Project, operating out of its online platform at Film Photography Project.com, has documented speed graphic shooting technique, film holder loading procedure, and lens selection in detail sufficient for a photographer with no prior large format experience to load and operate a speed graphic purchased from an estate sale. Kodak T-Max 100 in 4x5 sheet format, Ilford HP 5 Plus in 4x5, Fujifilm Provia 100F in 4x5, all available. All compatible with a camera that has not been manufactured since the early 1970s. The surprise the historical record offers about Graflex is not about its decline. It is about the camera that replaced it. The Nikon F, the specific instrument that ended the speed graphics dominance in American wire service photography, was designed in part through direct study of what AP and UPI photographers actually needed in the field. Nikon's engineering team in the late 1950s analyzed the working conditions of American press photographers with systematic attention, the physical stress of daily news assignment, the need for reliability under impact, and whether the requirement for a shutter rated to survive years of continuous professional use. They studied, among other things, the operational limitations of the speed graphic, what it could not do that a wire service photographer needed done. The camera built to replace Graflex was engineered around Graflex's own institutional customers. The speed graphic, in its obsolescence, provided the specification for its successor. In a display case in the George Eastman Museum in Rochester, New York, 2 miles from the building where it was made, there is a speed graphic pacemaker manufactured in the late 1940s, its serial number still legible on the body plate. The focal plane shutter fires. The film holders slide into the back with the precision of new manufacture. The rangefinder window is clear, the lens is sharp, no one loads it anymore, but if someone did, it would work. That is not a small thing. For an instrument built to record the world as it actually was, not as anyone wished it to be, not with any margin for imprecision to remain capable of doing exactly that. 75 years after it left the factory floor on St. Paul Street, is the most accurate measure of what Graflex built and what the American photographic industry lost when it was gone. Every week on this channel we tell these stories, the American companies that built the tools that recorded American life and what the market did to them. If this one mattered to you, subscribe. The next story is already waiting. It begins like this one with a camera that changed everything and a market that did not wait for it to change back.